So welcome to Seminar 5 of the International Year of the Salmon, the IYS Seminar Series. My name is Aidan Schubert, the IYS Coordinator for the North Pacific region. I'd like to acknowledge that the IYS Secretariat is based on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people. We thank them for their stewardship of these lands and waters that have sustained salmon since time immemorial. Data science can seem rather mysterious to many. However, it is critical for supporting effective salmon research and management. In today's seminar, our partners at the Hakai Institute will explore the world of data mobilization in the context of the IYS High Seas expeditions, bringing in the perspectives of an international panel of data specialists. The seminar series covers a range of topics related to the past and future IYS High Seas expeditions as the IYS team and scientists from across the North Pacific prepare for the IYS 2022 Pan-Pacific Winter Expedition that will take place in the coming months. You can register for the remaining seminars through the IYS website, where you can also find more information on the 2022 expedition and seminar recordings. Today's seminar will be recorded and made available on the website in the coming days, so be sure to pass this on to anyone who missed out today. We look forward to having your input in the discussion today, so please pose your questions using the Q&A function or by raising your virtual hand and we will unmute you. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Tim.
Fantastic. All right, let me share my screen here. Perfect. I hope everybody can share or see my screen. I apologize that my video is off. I was having a little bit of internet connection issues. But good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim. I'm a marine data scientist with the Hakai Institute. I'm thankful today for the opportunity to share my experiences just as we're about to head into the holiday season here. So I'll add a little bit of holiday cheer. During this seminar, I'd like to give a brief explanation on the concept of data mobilization. I'd like to speak to the work also that Brett and I have been doing for the IYS project, and also discuss the value of data mobilization and some of its roadblocks. So rather than it being a very tech-heavy talk, the onus of this seminar will be more around coming up with ideas and problem-solving the perceived risks involved with data mobilization. So let's get started. We are currently in the age of data, or the age of information. Data is being collected at and processed at an incredible speed, and we are beginning just to realize just how incredibly complex and interconnected our ecosystems are. Now, the value of data comes from its ability to be accurately analyzed and interpreted, and thereby used to inform decision-making and management. But when it comes to salmon ocean ecology data, a lot of this information is stored in heterogeneous and disparate data sets, and a lot of this data is unfortunately not publicly accessible. The data is often collected following different practices and standards, and that makes it more difficult for the data to be connected and exchanged, also known as being interoperable with one another. Now, important pieces of the data lifecycle are ensuring that the data are shared, preserved, and reused and integrated as well. And the topic of today's seminar will sort of be centered around these three key pieces. These stages are pretty important in providing rapid access and effective data synthesis that can be used to inform management scenarios for issues that are impacting salmon across their entire life cycle. Now, these issues, such as the impact of human activity or climate change, they are cross-boundary, and they do connect and hopefully concern us all. And this highlights the need for international research collaborations. Now, I believe that at the heart of effective international collaborations are two things: data, and perhaps more importantly, it's people. We do need sound scientific data to monitor and make effective data management decisions, but in turn, we also need scientists and good collection and process methods to analyze the data and to further improve on our data and our data practices as well. Now, beyond proper collection methods and storage and documentation, there is an increasing need within the scientific community for data preservation as well. And to this end, publishers are increasingly insisting on access to the data sets that are underpinning paper or journal submissions. In short, really what they're hoping for is that the data adheres to what are being coined the fair data principles. So the data needs to be findable, it needs to be accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. Now, for the data to adhere to these principles, it is strongly recommended that data is being mobilized to domain-specific and open source platforms or repositories. Data mobilization here is defined as data that's being mobilized or published to an open source platform where it can be found and accessed by anybody. In that sense, data mobilization is crucial not just for information circulation within the scientific community, but also to sort of connect the scientific community with a broader general audience. Now, with the International Year of the Salmon project, and perhaps especially for the 2022 expedition, there's multiple countries and vessels that participate in collecting salmon ocean ecology data across multiple zones and across a large geographic area. And for this data to be effectively mobilized and integrated with other data sets on an open source platform, it's important that the data follows a specific structure and where possible adopts community or international standards. This restructuring, as it were, of processed data is what's being coined data standardization. And in addition to this, data attributes or variables should be clearly defined by assigning controlled vocabulary to them. So these international research collaborations, such as the IWS, they further drive the need for a more unified or standardized approach when it comes to the collection, processing, and mobilization of data. So how do we at Hakai, how do we fit into this? At the Hakai Institute, we are pretty well positioned, I'd say, to play a leading role in implementing and developing cutting-edge data mobilization tools and efforts and adopt, where possible, community standards in ocean and coastal sciences. So we partnered with the MPAFC in 2019 to facilitate the mobilization of salmon ocean ecology data coming from these expeditions, with the hope to ensure that this data becomes interoperable both on a project scale as well as on a global scale. Now, in order to improve the findability and accessibility of the data, we have built some technical infrastructure, such as the International Year of the Salmon catalog, to act as a centralized point of access. So this catalog contains metadata records, and these records describe metadata as the data that describes the data, as it were. And this metadata conforms to international standards, which kind of allows this catalog to act as an index of where other data are being stored, which this in data sciences, this is known as data federation in short. So the metadata records link users to data that is hosted or published to global repositories or open source platforms. Now, in addition to making the existence of project datasets discoverable, we're also helping out with the more practical side of it. We're helping with standardization of the data and mobilizing it to domain-specific repositories. So what that means is that for a lot of the biological data that is being collected during these expeditions, we mobilize this to the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, known as OBIS. And for physical or geochemical data, a lot of this data is mobilized to ERDAP. So you can see here, and there's I've highlighted here a metadata record from the 2019 trawl catch data. And under data and resources, you can see a link to the record as it's published or mobilized to OBIS. So there are only a subset really of the data was mobilized to OBIS fairly recently, about 2 months ago. But you can see that it has already been downloaded 402 times, so probably even more since the time of making this presentation. Now, finally, as we do also recognize that proper data management is a key conduit for good data mobilization practices, we're also actively involved in creating a general data template and a data policy ahead of the 2022 expedition. So I've sort of spoken to the concept of data mobilization. I've spoken to our role as Hakai with the IYS project. I would like to speak to like wherein the power of data and data mobilization lies. So by ensuring that a lot of this data that we standardize adheres to the fair data principles, we ensure that it enhances the ability of machines also to automatically find and use the data, in addition to supporting its reuse by individuals. So by adopting and implementing international standards and controlled vocabulary for the data, this improves the federation across, as well as the integration within various repositories. This can significantly increase the exposure of published data. So for salmon research, data mobilization can, among other things, improve our knowledge of how climate, oceans, and salmons are all connected, sorry, as well as help us understand the various stressors on a salmon throughout their life cycle. But more specifically, however, for scientists, for data providers, mobilizing their data can benefit them through an increased number of citations for their published research. It can enhance their discoverability and the visibility of their data. You can get more credit for your work, helping you gain more recognition, as well as you can get validation and credit for your work through the reproducibility of your data. Now, wherever we talk about the rewards or the benefits of data mobilization, I feel that we also have to talk about some of the perceived risks and roadblocks associated with this new practice, or with data mobilization, as it were. There are practical limitations to data mobilization. It can be a time-consuming, fairly resource-intensive process, and it does require a little bit of technical know-how, so making it a little bit more prone to errors. In addition, data can be poorly attributed or wrongly interpreted, or downright misused. This is when I'd like to ask the audience, or I'd like to ask Aidan from the MPFC to bring up a poll, and I'd like to ask the audience for some participation, and I'd like to know what you believe to be the biggest roadblock to data mobilization. It's just a single choice, and the answers to this poll will be discussed in the ensuing panel discussion. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time to fill out this poll. Gives me the opportunity to have some water, some coffee. Aidan, is there a way to see if the majority of people have voted? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problems. We've had about half of the audience that have voted now, so I'll let you know once that slows down.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, so we're still getting a few answers trickling through, but it seems like most folks may have answered, so feel free to continue answering if you want to keep on moving there, Tim.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so there are ways, of course, to mitigate the risks involved with data mobilization. And I think we can all agree that where possible, we should strive for active data use and preservation of data and try to mitigate or reduce the risk of data misuse and or the perishing of data collected. So tools and documentation are actively being developed, and the concept of data mobilization is fairly new, so it is a very fluid field still. But tools and documentation are being developed to sort of improve our understanding of data mobilization practices. And some of these tools include the ESIP Biological Data Primer, as well as the Fair Aware Assessment Tool. Shout out to Jennifer to pointing me in the direction of the Fair Aware Assessment Tool. I think identifying key roadblocks to data mobilization and discussing mitigation measures to alleviate these roadblocks can further help really in changing the paradigm to a more inclusive approach whereby data is more often shared to further improve on the quality of data collected and thereby also hopefully strengthen partnerships within international collaborations and build on the legacy of the IWAS project, in this case in particular. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I don't know if there's any questions for me on that, but thank you very much. I will say indeed that the list of poll options is definitely not an exhaustive list, and there are perhaps many more options to be added or included. Please, during the panel discussion, please feel free to speak up to these if there's any others that you would like to see discussed. So I'm not sure if there's any questions for me personally. If not, you can always reach out to me. I'll put my email address in the chat here shortly. You can always reach out to me if you have any questions on data mobilization or the work that we've been doing with at Hakai with the International Year of the Salmon project. But then if there's no further questions, without further ado, I'd like for the panelists to perhaps briefly introduce themselves ahead of the panel discussion, and perhaps also tell us what they wish, what their biggest wishes for the holiday season coming up. So Jennifer, can I perhaps, I'll stop sharing my screen first off. And Jennifer, can I perhaps ask you to kick us off by giving a brief introduction to yourself?
Thank you, Tim. This is Jennifer Bayer, or Jen, as they usually go by. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey in the Northwest Regional Office near Portland, Oregon. I currently serve as the leader for PNAP, which is the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership. I have the good fortune to be able to lead this group of voluntary collaborators. It involves state agency staff, tribal staff, federal agency staff, pretty much anyone who wants to participate. Our goal is to improve efficiency, effectiveness, all these good things related to monitoring with emphasis on aquatic resource monitoring, fish habitat, and also significant push on data sharing and access. Before I was involved in this, I was a research fishery biologist. So my background is more on lampreys and cyprinids, but I have learned a whole bunch about salmon in the last 17 years of leading PNAP, because that is the biggest driver for what we're doing here in the Northwest. I think what I want for Christmas, I'll state the obvious. I would love for COVID to give us a break. So it's been cool to meet people. Graham's very, very far away. I wouldn't have met you, Graham, if we were doing this in person, but I sure miss the energy of seeing people in person. So go away, COVID. Thanks for the invitation.
Lovely, thank you very much. Graham?
Hi there. Yeah, for sure. But this is it's quite interesting with the Zoom meetings and such across such wide time zones. So I'm Graham Dyack. I am with the Missing Salmon Alliance, which is a group of UK conservation organisations focused on the conservation of Atlantic salmon and trout. And my background, I spent most of my working life in IT, working with IT infrastructure, and that kind of naturally progressed into data towards the end of my career in IT. And so I made kind of a decisive step to go straight into data science a couple of years ago, and that has led me to this work with the Missing Salmon Alliance. So I've not really got much of a background in biology, but I have I think a fairly strong background in IT and data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bryce?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tim, for the invite. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to seeing people's opinions as we go into the Q&A. My name is Bryce Meekum. I'm a software engineer at NCES. NCES is the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and I also work on the Data One project, which is a federation of data repositories. A large part or most of what I do at work is work on building software tools to help mobilization happen or make it easier when it does. So I'm super excited to be here. I also am project lead on the Yukon River Chinook salmon run timing forecasting project. I do that as an external entity from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, so I care intimately about having access to agency and fisheries data so I can do my work. And for holidays, I am most psyched about the shipment of my Nordic ice skate blades coming in. I just ordered a pair of those and they're super backlogged because they're still fabricating. But I'm looking to get out on the ice if that permits. Thanks.
Awesome. And last but not least, Ray?
It's okay, Tim. You can say I'm least. My name's hi. Thanks for inviting me. So my name's Ray Brunsting. I am from the Tula Foundation and Hakai Institute. Tula Foundation is a Canadian charity, and the Hakai Institute is one of our programs, which you've heard about already. My background, personal background, is I am a computer science guy. So, and from a long time ago, went to school here where I live in Waterloo, Ontario, which is around central Canada. And I've been basically spent a couple of decades building teams and building large integrated federated systems that help standardize data and make it available to people. For the first 10 years or so in health informations, and the last 10 years with the Hakai Institute focused more on ecological data. As well as working with Tim and the great my colleagues at Hakai, Tim and Brett and others. I also am co-chair of the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System Technical Committee. So some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may know USIUS. We're basically like the USIUS. We're Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System. It's been around for about 4 years so far, has longer background, and we're basically looking to mobilize and integrate historical and current ocean observations from Canada's coasts, which include Atlantic, Pacific, and the Arctic. So as part of that, I sort of, with my colleague from Dalhousie on Eastern Canada and working with Ocean Networks Canada and collaborators across the country, we're working to build a national federated system based on standards. And that's me. And for Christmas season, I am really looking, I look out my window, that's why I just looked out here. I have about this much snow. I'm looking forward to about this much snow or more because I like to cross-country ski. So I might be doing some skating as well, but I'm really looking forward to get out on skis this year and get out in the fresh air.
Lovely, perfect. Well, in that case, let me share my screen again so we can get started on the first question. All right, so first question that I'll pose to the panelists is, what will be your elevator pitch to encourage others to mobilize data? And can you provide an example of how it's made a significant impact on your work? I start perhaps with Bryce. Sure.
My pitch is more of the global thinking perspective. I wrote my notes up before this, so there's a tidal wave of progress worldwide on data mobilization. It's been building for quite some time, and that wave gets bigger every day. Many of the problems that we face as fisheries scientists or as humanity at large will demand greater amounts of data in increasingly diverse forms. The data used in this type of integrative science typically requires substantial amounts of time and money to discover, acquire, and then understand. All of this before the actual research we intended to do gets underway. This can have very real effects on very real effect of limiting the pace, scope, and scale of the research, which in turn may affect the kinds of problems we can solve. We owe it to ourselves, our colleagues, and the future generations of scientists to share data now, so when it comes time to tackle the next hard problem, we're already one step ahead. Data mobilization has impacted me 1,001 ways. I think the largest impact has been with us at NCEs. We ran a project called the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project. And one part of that was a massive data mobilization effort, which produced a variety of synthetic data sets derived from many, many raw data sets. And the real impact of that is that in addition to people being able to cite and download those products, the work I do on trying to develop tools and ideas that assist in mobilization, I've been able to work on top of those data. So the mere fact of having mobilized all of those data allows me and other researchers to build on top of the framework that's already been put forward by that mobilized data.
Very interesting, thank you. I'll pass it on to Graham. I'll also add that if there's any questions from the audience, please do feel free to put them in the chat. We can discuss those obviously as well. Graham?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I just want to kind of echo what Bryce said there about we seem to be on the tip of a kind of global wave of data mobilization, and I think for me, I've been in this in this role for a year and a half now, and when I first started, it felt like it always wasn't much in the way of drive for data mobilization. It almost feels now that everybody seems to know about it, and I keep trying to reflect on whether that's just because my own knowledge has increased, and so I know where to look now, or if there has actually been if there is actually that kind of a real kind of snowball effect with people are really engaging with it now. But what I try to do when I'm approaching people for kind of to encourage them to mobilize data is I try to put across the idea that the interoperability part of the FAIR system, which I think is probably one that most people kind of balk at. They see the findable and accessible, and they can maybe imagine how they can do that kind of quickly and easily. But the interoperability makes them, and when we see data standards and control vocabularies and ontologies, it can kind of be a little bit of a run for the hills. So I try to put across the idea that it can be done iteratively. It doesn't have to be all done in one go. Your data sets can be say made findable and accessible, and then the community can add to that. So the community of scientists that know about the data themselves can add to that interoperability over the course of, say, months or years. So it doesn't have to be all in one go. It has to be interoperable straight away. So that's what I try to put across to people when I'm pitching the idea of data mobilization. And I think that this has had a big impact on my work in that it's really shaped what I have, the way I've kind of approached the Missing Salmon Alliance project that I'm working on, in that I've really focused on building tools to bring these kind of baby steps, or these iterative approaches to people, and say, you know, fill out this form, so it's just a little bit of data, and then you can make that resource available, and then come back to a later date and add more detail as you go on. So that's I think that's kind of how I've approached it, and how it's impacted my work.
I like that a lot, because I agree that data mobilization as a concept can sound like a very daunting task, and it almost sounds like everything has to happen all in one go. Like, data has to be findable, it has to be accessible. You have to, you know, there's a whole bunch of semantics and ontology that can be built on top or be, you know, included within. And I often find that using baby steps or small steps to work towards having your data adhere to these fair data principles is probably the best way to go. Like, you cannot make data interoperable if you don't make it findable and accessible first. So that's it. Yeah, I like your approach or your thinking in that, Graham. Ray?
Yeah, thanks. I mentioned earlier I have a little bit of background in health information, a long background actually building like regional and national systems. And so I'll talk a little bit just briefly about that. So if you think about if you're sick, you go to your doctor and the doctor sends you maybe for blood work and a chest x-ray and that sort of thing, right? And so, you know, back in the old times, as far as the data goes, there's all these different tests for different people, and the results hopefully come in, you get it there. Like 30 years ago, or 20 or 30 years ago in health, that information was not standardized, was not exchanged so much. So it was really hard, and end up with duplication of effort, inefficiencies, just not good diagnosis, and therefore not good treatment, not good monitoring of the impact of treatment symptoms. So I guess if you use the analogy, and maybe I'm stretching here, so forgive me if I'm really stretching, but if you use the analogy of the Earth, we can say the Earth is sick. And what we have is a lot of scientists doing amazing work and doing individual measuring a lot of different symptoms. A lot of these things are being done by autonomous systems. So baseline, I'd call it baseline information that we're trying to monitor symptoms, what's happening with the Earth. A lot of great projects like International Year of Salmon and others and research associated with it are doing lots of you know, specific, more focused research efforts and gathering more information. And so, but it's still, I guess, why you want to mobilize your data is to, you know, make sure that it's available in ways that can be used to help understand the bigger picture, the whole symptoms, everything that's happening by yourself and by others. I'm not sure if I articulated very well, but I do have I boiled it down to like a one sentence thing. And I don't know, and I think elevator pitch, I think of like, you know, 20 seconds or 10-second thing. So, and this is more on an individual basis, scientific research. I'm not a scientific researcher, but I'm trying to think, well, what would motivate an individual researcher? I say, mobilizing your data will amplify the impact of your research, and your research will become more collaborative and cross-disciplinary, which will be rewarding and fun. I'm not sure if it'll be rewarding and fun. Hopefully it's already fun, but even we'll say more funner. Okay, so become more funner and be more amplified, and basically, you know, working more with other people and more cross-disciplinary. We see that at Hakai. We have, I'm sure lots of people here, a lot of people working together across disciplines, and that's happening more. And hopefully that will just continue to amplify as well. That's it for me.
Very interesting. So, given that you were sort of involved in the, you know, standardization within like the health realm, as it were. Are you noticing similarities between what happened there perhaps a few years back and what's currently, you know, happening with data mobilization more within biology?
Yeah, for sure. And in health, you don't make the open part isn't there. It's more about standardization and interchange. So it's more about the accessible and interoperable sort of part of it. But yeah, certainly like in the 90s, there was a lot of standardization happening for how like a CT scanner, X-ray scanner can send images to a printer or send images to a radiology workstation and things like that. And the company I was working for was at the early bleeding edge of that. So right standards are being developed, but it took like a decade and still evolving is to actually for the implementation and maturation of those things. And I do see that we're kind of, it's kind of exciting because I see a lot of that in this space where for various factors, a lot of standardization is happening now that maybe happened to like 20 or 30 years ago in healthcare. Partly there's more economic drivers in healthcare. So there's a lot more money poured by GEs and Siemens and stuff to develop these standards and stuff. So anyway, I'm not sure what the reasons are, but I do see that to answer your short question more succinctly, yes, I see lots of parallels. I see that sort of happening now. Has been happening for many years, but we're sort of at a sweet spot where it's gained a lot of momentum, as the previous speakers were saying. So I see lots of good things happening.
Thanks, Roy. Jen, what will be your elevator pitch for data mobilization?
As I'm sitting here, I'm trying to adapt my elevator pitch because all of what's already been said is about half of what I was going to say, which is great, where I think it's consistent. I can see I am a biologist by training, and really what I do now is facilitate help by helping people collaborate. So a little, and we're always scrabbling for dollars to do the facilitation part too. So I'll start with why should you mobilize your data? Because data drives decisions. Everybody's already said that. I've seen, we spend millions and millions of dollars acquiring data. We don't spend nearly as much money, even a fraction of that, right? Taking care of it, making it available, ensuring that someone can use it in 100 years. Those are the things that if we could support that, that would be a very useful reason to mobilize your data, that it could be available in the long run. The simple things like more data gives more confidence in your decision-making, your analysis leading to decision-making. You can add value to existing data from one program by integrating it with another one. Unanswerable questions suddenly become accessible to us. We can gain efficiency and how not only analyzing data, but collecting data. Perhaps you don't have to go out and collect it if you have access to someone else's. So there's lots of ways to squeeze the limited pennies that we have and try and get more out of it. I think that the biggest impact I'm seeing right now on my side is the technology has changed so much in the last 10 years to make this available. The possibilities, maybe it's thanks to guys like Ray, and maybe even before healthcare, it was the banking industry, right? There's like, we're finally getting around to natural sciences, so we can build on that work. But what I think the impact I see is that we are still behind on the human infrastructure side, that we need to support the human beings to engage in things like developing controlled vocabularies and understanding the mechanisms that are out there, but making the mechanisms accessible to the people. So, and I think I see that in my own work. I think the impact for us mostly I work in the Northwest of the US and Columbia Basin specifically, we're being asked to do more of work to support data sharing, which is great. 10 years ago, we were fighting with biologists to convince them that this was an important idea. And now we're being asked to support on the facilitation side of things, more of this developing of data standards to share data. So I feel like I've lost my message because I was trying to adapt as we went, but I think that the most simplest crass reason for mobilizing your data is saving money, right? There is a lot of it being spent right now, but it's never enough. No one entity has enough dollars to collect, organize, access, analyze all the information they need. There isn't any single entity that has enough money to do it solo. Not to mention the creativity and the opportunities of putting things together that we hadn't planned or anticipated, as Ray was suggesting, more funner for the scientist. So I think I'll stop there and leave it for discussion.
Fantastic. No, I definitely agree that we need to try and gain as much value out of the collected data as we possibly can. You were already alluding to some of the roadblocks when it comes to data mobilization and trying to get people involved in that concept. And I think it's a nice segue into our second question here as well, unless there's questions from the audience, which I do not believe currently there is. So I'll briefly share my screen.
Just looks like we've got one from Matt in the chat there, Tim.
Perfect. Matt mentions that on the human side that Jen raised, do the motivators for mobilization differ for academic researchers, government agency researchers, and agency managers? Can we get them all mobilizing and publishing their data consistently? Any of the panelists want to speak to that, perhaps?
I'll jump in first, just from my perspective. I think the motivators are different, and some of the worries are different as well. On the academic side, the worry about getting, someone jumping the gun on your publishing your intentions to publish your data is a worry. On the management side, for both state and tribal entities, there are concerns about misuse of data if it's not fully understood when someone else, a third party, wants to use it. And so the motivation often in our world is related to regulatory decision making and tied to funding. So that can be a very consistent motivator, i.e. you get the dollar, so therefore you must provide the data back. I think it's more of a carrot or more of a stick than a carrot. I think that there are a lot of more and more people working across jurisdictions to share the, how do I say it, more and more desire to work across jurisdictions and willingness to mobilize data. I will say that it would be good if we could have more directed targets of what information should be shared, i.e. we don't have to share all the data. I think that might help with understanding both motivation and barriers.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a fantastic prompt, Matt. Jen said there's always this kind of carrot versus stick problem, and oftentimes the stick is the useful tool. And I have seen that over time and time again. I have seen, though, more recently that we're finding more and more agency people and even agency higher ups, and as well as academics that are getting more interested. And what really helps is building very usable tools, software tools that make that path look approachable. If you're an agency boss, that's my staff can't spend too much time on this. If you're an academic researcher, I don't have any time for this. So the tools being funding into tooling, and then outreach and education for those tools and support, I think can go a long way. And we've seen a lot of success with who we've worked with in agency and in academia. I will say to the last question, how can we get everyone mobilizing and publishing data consistently? What I've also seen in my work in fisheries is these groups tend to be fairly separated. The academics are over here and the government folks are over here. I think the only way to get that to happen will be to get those folks working together. And I don't quite know the answer to that, but that's what I'd like to see. I think that when people work together across agencies or groups, they teach each other things, they find best practices, and everything meshes together much more nicely rather than trying to do it at the end.
Great. I see that there's another question from Scott. Scott asks, what is the scope of term data mobilization? Is this discrete from knowledge management, science mobilization, and decision support, or does it mean from field to decisions?
I'll maybe comment on that a little bit, I guess, because I did notice in your presentation, Tim, you kind of did define it for, I guess, purposes of this conversation, but I did mention in a previous email that it's kind of opening a can of worms when you try to really nail it down on what the definition is. So I guess, yeah, in your presentation, you defined it as basically the fair process, and you did add to the openness aspect to that as well. And so, yeah, I think I think it can be that I don't think it has to have the open aspect to it, but others may disagree. I think that that the FAIR principles themselves, I don't think they necessarily mean that it has to be open, but the existence of a data set can, you know, if somebody knows it exists and then they ask for the author for the data and the data says no, it's I guess the accessible bit is kind of blown out the water there, but you know, at least it's kind of gotten to a certain stage. So I think I don't want to try and define data mobilization, but I do think that it has to have at least that kind of aspect to it, the kind of interoperable, reusable aspect to it, and then going on to the latter stages, which we talked about before. I think the aspect of the decision support and the from field to decisions, I think that might be, I'm forming the opinion that might be more than just data mobilization. So yes, like Scott says, knowledge mobilization, science mobilization might encompass those things further on. So basically just what you said there, Scott.
Fantastic. All right. I would suggest that we move on to the second question. I'll briefly share my screen again. Move on to second question. Now, I know, Aidan, that you shared the results of the poll with me, and I unfortunately clicked it away, and now I can't seem to find it anymore. Is there a way for you to bring up the results from that poll again?
Yeah, I can. I think the audience should be able to see it, but maybe shall I read out the top answers for you? Would that work? Or I can put them in the chat.
That would be great. Yeah.
Sure.
You might be able to click on polls at the bottom, Tim, to get it back up again.
Oh, there we go. Oh, thank you.
No worries.
Fantastic. Okay. So if I share my screen again, does that work? Well, looking at the polls, or the result from the polls, it would appear that the majority of people have acknowledged that there is a lack of knowledge in how to restructure or standardize the data. So there is a technical barrier, as well as like a fairly big social barrier as well. There is that fear that data is being misused, or that there is poor attribution. And there's typically also a lack of resources, both time and funding. Interestingly enough, the majority of the options were chosen, and I think somebody in the audience mentioned that as well, that if they could choose all of the options, then they would have, which does go to show, I guess, that we do have some roadblocks to battle when it comes to mobilizing the data. But speaking to these this technical barrier and perhaps these social barriers, what would be the first steps to sort of mitigate these or reduce these barriers?
I can jump in on that one a little bit, because, you know, I was a little bit surprised, probably relieved, I'm not sure. But anyway, to look at that lack of knowledge and how to structure, because I think that sort of is a little bit, you know, ours and many other people's wheelhouse a little bit, how to share that or how to improve that knowledge. One of the reasons we're involved with IYS is not because we just have the technical capacity, because we actually fundamentally believe in this sort of a concept of data mobilization, like many others on this call. And so how do you address lack of knowledge? And it's just, you know, education and time and bringing it up and participating in these kind of seminars and webinars and other more technical avenues to actually increase the general level of knowledge and experience across the board. So that'll take time, and it is happening. I think everyone's already said that was like a tidal wave or something of interest in data mobilization. So along with that comes more classes you can take and more seminars you can go to and things like that. But it's not really for everyone. I don't think the right approach is to you know, silo things too much. I don't think anyone would agree with that. Meaning that, you know, it's this. I do see that sometimes. Oh, it's the within an organization, within our organization, there's science. We sort of lob it over the wall to the techie people, right? And we deal with that. I think we need a little bit more integrated approach. And I think that's partially with more science background people gaining or who are interested in data mobilization, data standardization, helping them build and increase their skills in that area. We're doing that at Hakai. Tim, actually, we're going to have our winter series, once a month internal webinar for all the sciencey data field people that they're welcome to come to, and when we'll share and provide tools and how to use GitHub, how to use R, how to use that sort of thing. So we're trying to do it by taking the sciencey field people and you know, help them, give them the tools and knowledge they have to apply to their scientific domain of interest. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ray. Bryce, would you perhaps like to speak to the various barriers identified?
Yeah, thanks. These are all fantastic. I think that a lot of these you can kind of, almost all of them you can kind of flip on their head in some ways. You know, things like technical barriers, you know, lack of knowledge or such, that can be considered an opportunity for an organization to bring on someone like a librarian or information scientist or someone like a data manager. I think that organizations don't allocate a space to do that. I don't necessarily think that every single scientist at your organization needs to be an expert in data mobilization or data documentation. I think that you know, the cost shouldn't be applied necessarily to every individual. And I love librarians, and I'd love to see more librarians everywhere, basically. Things like the no resources and time. I think people think that, but what I've seen in my experience is that taking the time to mobilize by documenting, making available, making structured, is time you spend now. But if you don't do that, it's time you're going to have to spend at some point. At some point, what you're doing as research is going to be interesting to managers or your funder, and you'll spend all that time later on anyway. And you might not necessarily get as good a product as if you had mobilized and done all that work continuously throughout the life cycle of the project. So it's kind of a perception problem. I think in actuality, mobilization is a time and money saver.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It's perhaps a little bit more time upfront at the beginning of the research project, but it definitely saves. At least in my experience, I would say it saves a lot of time in the back end in mobilizing the data. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this, Jen?
I agree with everything Ray said, except for that last bit. I think that I've seen this. I do think, again, it's changing over time, where we're seeing, but in general, I will say for state and tribal entities that are collecting information for their own use, primarily for local or regional, smaller scale geography type decision making, they typically don't have dollars and time to make that information available to third-party users. And when they must, for example, in the US, we have NOAA as a regulatory entity for listed species, where a state or tribe must provide data to NOAA for decision making, they will. And that's really the motivation for the systems we built, to make it easier for that data flow to happen. But in general, it is a burden on the data provider that is rarely provided for financially. So one of the things we've done on this human infrastructure side is pressure those third-party users, pressure NOAA fisheries, pressure Bonneville Power Administration, give me money from Environmental Protection Agency, which supports the exchange network here in the US, to fund the development of the systems and capacity building in states and tribe agencies. So I think it is getting better, and I think it's changing over time, because once you get the concept of a system, once you have a statewide database built for certain types of fisheries data, it's easier to add and expand. And the human beings' brains are sort of programmed to do it. But I do think that someone needs to pay for that to take the data from the local use where they need it for their decision-making at a smaller scale and make it available to someone else, especially to aggregate it and integrate it and make a new data product, requires time and money for facilitation and support, and probably system development, because I do totally agree, Bryce, if you have tools that make it easy, that's definitely going to make it more likely to succeed to get people to engage. But I think that I see over and over that that's generally pushback, that we don't have time in our day or dollars to hire more people to do this support to make data available for third parties.
Do you feel that when you have to pressure these agencies or these organizations to be, I guess, to put more resources or money into data mobilization, that you sort of have to win them over and re-explain the concept of data mobilization and its values as well?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, when we started that we used examples from NOAA of how they had a cadre of data technicians basically calling each biologist literally one at a time on a 5-year cycle for 5-year status assessments and say, please provide the data for the last, X years. And they'd talk to a biologist and they'd send a spreadsheet, and then they might get a data dictionary, they might not, or it might match they might have changed it from one year to the next. And so there's various calls and back and forth. It took a lot of time before that 5-year data set was in a state that it could be handed to the analyst, who would then start their work and then eventually produce a report. So by making the data, consistent in the standard and ensuring that we have consistent methods, that was a first step as well. It's much more efficient, it's much more transparent, and actually gives a lot more ownership to the data provider, because it really is a workflow starting with them, instead of I handed this spreadsheet off, I'm going to send you another one, and then someone at one federal agency is doing all that work on their own desktop. This is much more consistent and transparent and gives more ownership to the provider. So there's a lot of benefit. And I think that does help get us to what Bryce was saying, where it is easier and it does really save time in the long run, but it's, you have to, maybe it's the snowball, and the snowballs, we need more snow, like Ray was saying, to get there.
Yeah, very interesting. Graham?
Yeah, I'll be quick because I'm conscious of the time. So just on the note of the fear in data misuse, I think the academic world already relies quite heavily on automated software to detect plagiarism. And I think it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that systems like that could be in place for data as well. But also just the ethics of it, and especially if we're talking kind of pure research, generally you will be, if you're doing your job right as a researcher, you'll know the data inside out, you'll know the source, and you'll be able to attribute it properly. And if you don't, then people will, your peers will call you out for it. So I think that should hopefully, put that kind of idea of the fear of misuse to bed. Obviously, outside the scope of academia, it might not be so cut and dry as that. And yeah, in terms of the lack of knowledge and no resources, a quick example which I heard of was the idea of people who are government agencies who have to abide by freedom of information requests. They're making a rod for their own back by not making data available and standard, because every time they get a request, they have to put the data request together again and distribute it. So if they could do it once and then distribute it many times, much easier.
I'm noticing that we're fairly towards the end of our hour here. Aidan, Caroline, I don't know if we have much more time to perhaps go over a third question. I doubt it. I don't know what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah, I think maybe wrapping up might be best for everybody's time at this stage.
Fantastic. Okay, well, in that case, I'd just like to thank first and foremost the panelists for joining us today, and of course the audience. I really hope that we've been sort of able to speak to the concept of data mobilization, some of its roadblocks, and work towards mitigating these roadblocks, and hopefully we can ensure that more data hopefully adheres to the fair data principles moving forward, and work towards mobilizing data. I'm still a big proponent of mobilizing it to open source. Perhaps that's somewhere something that me and Graham agreed to disagree on. But yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today, and I hope that you all learned something on data mobilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thanks everyone.
Just for those that are still here, I'll quickly share my screen and let you know about the 6th seminar coming up on January 18th. And it'll be involving a panel of scientists from the Atlantic and Pacific basins and exploring a collaborative project known as the Likely Suspects Framework. You can register on the IYS website, and we hope to see you there. So thanks again for joining, and have a great day from wherever you're tuning in from.